It's good to see this number out. Just went downstairs and went into Jesse Jackson's class, and I said, man, you got more than what I got. That may not be true. Maybe it's because we're all kind of spread out, but he's got a whole class full. So glad that this number can be out. I'm sure we've got a few more that are joining on YouTube that otherwise probably would be here just because of road conditions in various parts of the county, but we are thankful that those that are here. Let's pray for safety for everyone. All right, we're going to be picking up in Lesson 3 here in just a moment, continuing with Zechariah. So before we begin, we'll just be reminded of our 17 time periods before the flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest of Canaan, the judges, the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, Judah alone, the captivity, and of course we are currently in the return from captivity, and we'll also discuss the years of silence toward the end of the quarter, and then next quarter move into the life of Christ, and then continue on with the early church and the letters to the Christians. So just as way of a reminder, there are 3 returns that we will be discussing. We're currently the one that is considered the one under Zerubbabel, where the altar's been rebuilt. The temple will be completed in Ezra 5 and 6 that we'll get into with Lesson 4. And so Haggai and Zechariah are both prophesying toward the beginning of this return. And Zechariah is someone that we know for a fact prophesied for 2 years, potentially longer, but we do know the dates from 520 to 518. And we talked last week just briefly how the book kind of divides itself into really 2 major sections, with chapters 1 through 6 talking about the visions. And there are 8 night visions, and all of these visions were received in the same night. We talked just very briefly about some of them. And then when you get into chapter 7 through 14, it really is focusing on beyond the temple. And of course, so much of what we read in Zechariah is messianic prophecies, and there's so much detail that's given within those chapters as far as Jesus himself. So we're going to continue on. We had discussed question 1, so we're going to pick up with question 2 now. It says, Zechariah chapter 1, verses 7 through 17. The patrol reports that the nations are at rest. Why is this troubling given Jerusalem's condition? And what does God's response reveal about his character and intentions for Zion? So this is roughly 3 months after Zechariah's initial call for them to repent. He receives these night visions, and this is one of the first one that he sees, with the man riding on the red horse amongst the myrtle trees, and there are other horses that are behind him. So what do we take away from that? Why would this be troubling given Jerusalem's condition? So the horses are identified for us in verses 10 through 11 as those that were sent by the Lord to patrol the earth. And I think that one of the things that we see from the vision is that one of the things that it's teaching us is that God really is fully informed about the affairs of the nations. He knows what's going on, and so these are kind of symbolic of those that are going around. But the report is troubling because in verse 11 it talks about how all the earth is peaceful and quiet. And so all of these nations around Jerusalem, they're at ease, and yet in the situation that we're still currently in, Jerusalem remains in ruins. The temple is unfinished. And so one of the things that we might recall from Haggai when he was prophesying, how he had spoken of the shaking and judgment of the nations. And so when we look at Zechariah specifically with this vision, what we see is with the peace of these nations suggests that, well, judgment hadn't fallen yet. Judgment had not come entirely yet. But then we see God's response, and I think that God's response really does reveal his heart. And he speaks in verse 13 of chapter 1, talking about with gracious words, with comforting words. And in verse 14, he talks about being jealous for Jerusalem and Zion. And so there is going to be further disaster for these nations. In verse 16, though, it talks about how I will return to Jerusalem with compassion. And so God knows what's going on, and he sees, and God is raising powers to kind of punish Jerusalem, the children of Israel, but they too are going to ultimately see judgment. And one of the things that we see is, well, there's maybe a delay because there seems to be peace. And we'll talk about this some even in our next lesson, but God's delay doesn't mean indifference, and it doesn't mean that He is not in control, because when we see evil people or evil nations that are flourishing, that doesn't mean that God still is not in control. So I think that this is something that the children of Israel should be comforted by, that God is still committed to His plan for them and for Zion. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, and one possibility is that I've seen some explanations that sometimes the prophets aren't always talking from their moment in time forward, that they look a little bit back and then may talk a little bit about the current and then may talk a little bit about the future. This, to some extent, this peace might be what the Persian Empire has brought to the world. I was thinking similar to how we were studying in our Ephesians class, how the Romans created this peace, which was a benefit for the gospel. And so, obviously, the Persians conquered, and they conquered far and wide, and so now there's this stability and even a favorable environment for God's work to now begin, because Cyrus commands them to rebuild.
Yeah.
So maybe that's possible, that's the idea of the earth being peaceful and quiet.
Yeah, and that kind of goes along with some of the things that we read even in Ezra chapter 6 with people that were not Jews, that were in fact Gentiles that had washed themselves and actually accepted God. I think that's in chapter 6, verses 21 or 22. And we'll talk about that some in our next lesson. But yes, that's a good point. Anything else on number 2? So number 3, dealing with Zechariah 1:18 through 21, it says, the 4 horns and 4 craftsmen symbolize opposing powers. What do these images teach about God's sovereignty, and how would this vision encourage a small, vulnerable remnant? So whenever we typically see an image of horns within scriptures, what does that typically symbolize? What'd you say? Evil? It typically is representing power, authority, a certain amount of strength. And one of the things that some people will try to tell you is, well, of these 4 horns, they'll try to list them, and with the one horn is this group, the other horn is this group. I don't necessarily think that there are specific people that are intended for these powers. But he talks about, and the angel explaining that these horns represent the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem there in verse 19. And so, again, rather than identifying specific nations, I think that it's just pointing to overall that the world powers that had opposed and crushed God's people over time. And I think that it's kind of a pattern of oppression, again, not necessarily fixed on specific empires, or I wouldn't get caught up in that, just my reading of it. So what do we think of? Go ahead, Daddy.
There is a passage in Daniel, chapter 2 and verse 20 kind of explains this a little. It says, let the name of God be praised forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to Him. He changes times and seasons, disposing some kings and establishing others. He gives wisdom to the wise. He imparts knowledge to those with understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light resides with Him. So what we've seen throughout the history of man, that's what happens. We have nations come into power, and it's all because God's plan, and they're brought down, they're built up, and like we said, this is just I think another example of God behind the scenes with different nations and the power of nations and what they're doing. And that's what we were seeing here. I mean, the nations, the Gentile nations were prospering around Jerusalem, yet Jerusalem's temple was still laying in ruins. We remember what Haggai was saying, and what the people were saying. Well, it ain't time yet. They built their houses, but it's not time for the temple yet. So there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, I mean, and just within this time frame, obviously we know that Babylon is going to be or replace Assyria. Persia is going to overthrow Babylon. Greece is later going to overthrow them. And so there's this constant cycle of nations that rise as a horn, really against God's people, and then God raises up another power that breaks that horn. So when we see this, the image of the four craftsmen, I mean, what do we think about whenever we think about a craftsman? Builders, yeah. I mean, I think that it's pretty easy to understand this idea of being, or the idea of building. And I think that overall, when we look at this with the four horns and then the four craftsmen, I think that the key lesson really is that God's absolute sovereignty over world events. He knows what's going on. He's still in control of everything that is happening. And this is something that, again, to the people should be comforting because he's not saying that the opposition is not real. It is real, but it is only temporary and not ultimate, that God himself is the ultimate power. He is still governing, and he governs the rise and the fall of these nations. And it is God himself who breaks horns, and it is God who delivers in his time. Anything else on number 3? Todd?
Yeah, I think the number 4 is also significant. You see a consistency in the Bible of it always relating to the earth. A passage in Revelation 7, it says, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth. And so, we might associate it with the compass, right? North, south, east, and west. It's the idea of all the surrounding parts of the earth, every direction as far as it would go. So I think that's consistent here in Zechariah, that you've got these 4 horns or 4 nations. Basically, everyone who surrounds Judah is now being opposed by God, who says, no, I'm sending in my forces to actually build.
And we continue to see the opposition, even in Ezra chapters 5 and 6, after the people continue to build, but yet God is with them, and we see still that his plan is going to be fulfilled. All right, question number 4 deals with Zechariah 2, verses 1 through 13. It says, Jerusalem is shown as a city without walls. Why does this vision go beyond a literal description of the city, and what is the Lord communicating through this imagery? So, of course, this is the image of a man with a measuring line there in the first couple of verses. And what does that typically depict in Scripture when we see someone with a measuring line? All right. So it's judgment. Depending upon the imagery, it could symbolize destruction, or it could also symbolize rebuilding. And so in the context of what we're reading here, what's the meaning?
Rebuilding.
It's rebuilding. I mean, this is really the restoration. The city had already been destroyed, and the Lord had promised back in chapter 1 that a measuring line will be stretched over Jerusalem. And so this is the rebuilding. But I think that the vision quickly goes beyond just the physical reconstruction. So what's the Lord communicating through the imagery here?
Spiritual Jerusalem, the church, and it's without walls.
All right, so yes, talking about, of course, as we've mentioned, beyond the temple here, and there's been so much that's brought up about the temple itself, and that there's going to be far greater glory in the temple to come. And Jerusalem is what April said, is described as a city without walls, and talks about a multitude of people there in verse 4. And so I think that you have this idea of expansion and this idea of growth. And, typically, what would you think of with an unwalled city? It's vulnerable, yeah. So typically, and I mean, we see this with physical Jerusalem at this point. Obviously, the walls are not going to be rebuilt until later, but they're vulnerable. But yet, what does God say? He's surrounding it with a wall of fire. All right, so there is an immense amount of protection now. They're not vulnerable. There in verse 5, it says, I will be a wall of fire around her, and I will be the glory, in her midst. So protection is going to come from God. I think it's interesting with this as we move on in Ezra, again with chapters 5 and 6, and we really do see God continuing to protect him, his presence being there. And as April said, I mean, the vision is pointing to spiritual Jerusalem, and the fact that God is going to restore this remnant, and he is going to be their provider, their protector. And so verses 6 and 7, it talks about really a call for them to come out of bondage. Again, there in verses 10 and 12, he declares that he will dwell in the midst of his people. And so ultimately, I think what we see is that the kingdom here is not going to be defined by walls. It's not going to be defined by borders. It's not going to be defined by human strength. But it is ultimately going to be defined by God's presence, by his protection, and continuous growth. Anything else on number 4? All right, question number 5 deals with Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 through 10. And Joshua there stands before the Lord in filthy garments while Satan accuses him. What does this vision teach about guilt, cleansing, and God's initiative in removing sin? And why are Joshua, his companions, called a sign? And how does the promise of the branch explain how the land's guilt would be removed? So what's Joshua representing here?
Sins and uncleanness.
Yeah, I think that he's just a representative of the people here. And this is a real problem. I mean, Satan's accusations that he's made, when it talks about Joshua being clothed in filthy garments, we know that Israel was guilty of sin, and they had been judged and punished because of that. And so what else do we read from this, though? Daddy?
The priest himself would have been defiled.
Okay.
As well as the spiritual leaders of the nation.
Okay.
We cannot stand acceptably before God with sin. He alone can cleanse us from sin and clothe us with righteousness.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things we see just from the vision is there in verse 2 that the Lord actually rebukes Satan, and then he's not denying the guilt of Israel, but he is going to cleanse them. He is going to remove that. There in verse 4 it says, "See, I have taken your iniquity away from you." And then we see in verse 5 a clean turban is placed on Joshua's head. And so he's cleansed now as the priest to be able to perform his priestly service. And I think that one of the things that we see just from this image, it's kind of echoed in one of the things that we see with Isaiah when he talks about, though your sins be as scarlet, they will be as white as snow. And God is going to be able to cleanse him. So what do we take away as far as the branch? What's the key aspect of the branch here? Right, so we see, and we'll see this again in Zechariah, but we recognize that Christ as the branch, he's really going to be the key of how this cleansing is going to how it's going to take place. And of course, we know that with the branch, there's going to be a once-for-all atonement that is going to happen. All right, anything else on number 5? Norm?
The branch is also not part of Joshua's life. Like it's specifically called out another place. Like it is separate from the Levitical priesthood.
Yeah.
Which should have been an eye-opener for anybody
Yeah.
paying attention.
Yeah. Todd?
You see Satan here being Satan. That word means adversary or accuser. And so this is one place, not the only place, where we see him doing that very thing. He's there to accuse us, and that's how he wants to bring us away from God, is to point out our sins. And God obviously takes it away by his grace. The other thing is, you notice what he promises to Joshua in verse 7. It's surprising that a priest would be told that you're going to govern my house and have charge of my courts and to be granted free access. I mean, those are very gracious gifts, and they're not typically given to the priest. And so it's suggesting this dual nature that we'll see again later.
Yeah.
With the priest and the king.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we see very clearly spelled out that they wouldn't have understood just because of the roles of a king and the roles of a priest. But yes, how we see the combining of those. And while we see just within the vision, the restoration of the priest, that's not, merely what is happening here. But I think that with the message he's announcing that there's going to be something coming where sin is going to be removed. Again, God's going to dwell with his people again, and there's going to be peace that follows. All right, question number 6. So this is coming from Zechariah 3, verses 8 through 10, and also chapter 6, verses 9 through 15, specifically dealing with the branch now. It says, "The branch is promised as one who will build the temple and unite priesthood and kingship. Why would this challenge Israel's expectations after the exile? And what questions would it raise about the kind of work God intended to accomplish?" And this is a little bit different because Zechariah is not really shown a vision here, but he's actually performing a symbolic act. So what do we take away from this? So, of course, as we've already mentioned, he's been introduced there in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 8. But then in chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, "Behold, a man whose name is Branch." And again, he's going to be the one that removes the sin of the land in a single day. Again, there in verse 12, it's talking about one who had sprung up from among the people. And I think that also echoes what we read over in Isaiah 53, "A root out of dry ground." Again, this idea of a temple that's going to be greater, because it says that the branch there in verses 12 and 13 is going to build the temple of the Lord. And so, again, God is pointing past the physical, and he's pointing to something that is greater, something that is longer, much, much longer lasting. And while the temple being rebuilt obviously was important, we know that from all of Ezra, but it wasn't ultimately the final goal. Let me get Jesse, and then I'll get Norm.
So just answering the questions here. Obviously, the priest, according to law of Moses, would have to come through Levi. And the line of kings, they know that's through David and Judah. So that would challenge their minds and understanding. And then there already exists a physical temple. So why would this branch build another temple and then rule as priest and king? And those from afar build the temple. So yeah, that would challenge their thing. What does this all mean?
Yeah. Norm?
And again, juxtaposing this statement from Zechariah based on the reaction when the temple was actually being rebuilt. And those that remember the previous temple compared to the new temple that was being built. And the downgrade that it was from the glory that it had been under Solomon when he made it. And then you got this statement saying this is going to be so much greater. And trying to shift away from their physical thoughts of being rulers of the world to this is God trying to remove sins. You're going to be the method or the place to which he does it. But it's going to be great and glorious. You're going to have a key role in it. And they're just not wanting to see it.
And I think to just recognize, again, the situation that they're in, I think at this point, they're still kind of in survival mode. I mean, I know it's been, 15, 16 years, but they're just trying to survive. They've still got all these people that are around them that are much, much stronger than they are. They're being told to rebuild, and so they're trying to recover, some semblance of what has been lost. And then now they're being told that in chapter 6, verse 13, that there's going to be someone that's going to sit on the throne and he's going to be a priest on the throne. And it's like, this doesn't even make sense. And so all of this imagery that he is using, talking about this new kind of temple, a new kind of ruler, is something that obviously just within the significance of what they had going on might be something that is difficult for them to understand. But I think that ultimately one of the things that they should be able to see is that God was not abandoning the present work, and while not abandoning the present work, he is continuing to work something far greater that's going to happen in the future. All right, number 7, this is from Zechariah chapter 4, 1 through 10. Zerubbabel is told the work will succeed not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. How does this message confront discouragement, and how should the day of small things reshape how God's people measure faithfulness and success? And Todd had discussed the imagery of this last week with the golden lampstand before the Lord's Supper, of course, receiving the oil directly from the olive trees. Jesse?
Just when the work maybe seems daunting and overwhelming and maybe at times impossible to accomplish, remember the Lord is with us and will surely accomplish his will among his faithful people.
You know, one of the things we talk about the situation that the people are currently in, and, you know, they, as humans, and I think that we would probably be similar, I mean, they're probably trying to measure success, one, by political power, by manpower. We talk about just a remnant returning, by visible progress, and I mean, there was not a whole lot of that going on, and I think that God is trying to reframe the situation and help them recognize and understand who he is, and that the work is going to succeed because of his will, not because conditions are favorable, because in their minds, conditions were not very favorable with what's going on right now. Other comments? What do we take away from the day of small things? So God asked for who has despised the day of small things there in chapter 4 and verse 10. So what's the issue with that in regards to faithfulness? Todd?
Maybe there's a connection to the weeping that the men wept when they considered the way things were better before, and things are not great, but every bit of small progress is progress in the Lord's kingdom, and God sees it. That's why he's the one who's saying, you know, Zerubbabel will bring forth the top stone. It will be finished. I think about Jesus' lesson about the kingdom being like a mustard seed. So it's a small thing that we shouldn't despise because of the growth that can come.
Yeah, again, their mindset is physical because, okay, the foundation had been laid, and it in and of itself was, in their minds, a very modest, or at least the ones that had seen the previous temple, a modest foundation. They seem to be struggling to some degree. They don't seem to have a whole lot of resources until we get to chapter 6, and they have all the resources that they need. But in their mind, these things are maybe small beginnings, but God's evaluation of the whole thing is you need to remain faithful because there are things happening that you can't see and that you don't understand. And so, and Todd talked about this some last week, but this idea of the lampstand, I mean, it represents God's ongoing work through himself, and this oil flowing continuously. God is going to provide for everything that they need because the people are not the source. God himself is the source. And so he's trying to help shift their mindset to what can we accomplish to what am I going to accomplish through you? Because again, God is the one that is in control, and that should be helping to reframe their mindset. Daddy?
I like the passage in Lamentations, and a lot of us have this saying on the plaque or whatever, but Lamentations chapter 3 and verse 22 says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end, they are new every morning. great is your faithfulness. And so it's a daily renewal of the, things that God has blessed us with. Take one day at a time, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that's important for us to be reminded of too, because we get so caught up in our everyday lives and our own struggles, and so we have to recognize that that God requires us to have faith for us to be obedient, but to also recognize His providence, His care, His power, and His grace. All right, anything else on number 7? All right, question number 8 comes from Zechariah chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. A king comes humble and riding on a donkey, yet rules from sea to sea. How does this passage redefine power and kingship? And how does the New Testament show Jesus fulfilling what is described here? So Zechariah, he announces really a moment of joy there in verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. What's the reason for the rejoicing? Who's coming? The king is coming. And we talk about some of the imagery and the figures that we see of Jesus. And I mean, this is immediately something that we recognize as messianic, and obviously being the king, bringing salvation. One of the things that Zechariah, in his description here, he talks about the king being righteous, endowed with salvation. He talks about him being humble, riding on a donkey. So how would a king typically enter a city? Yeah, I mean, a horse or a chariot, some type of military display to show strength and might. And so what would a donkey symbolize? Yeah, I mean, there's lowliness. I think that there's a certain amount of peace. I think when we think of a king and he's coming through with this great military display, and it gives us the idea of strength and power. But then we see this with a donkey, and I think there's a certain amount of peace and humility, obviously, that comes from that. But then so we have him coming in this humble manner, but then how big is his reign going to be? So we're dealing with Jerusalem, we're dealing with Israel, and what does Zechariah mention about his dominion? From sea to sea. So again, he's trying to get the people to understand, you're living in your small world and all of these things going on, but there is someone that is greater that is going to come. Your king is going to come, and he is going to reign from sea to sea. Lena?
Didn't also Solomon come into Jerusalem on a donkey or on a mule? He was instructed by David. And so this prophecy goes, and Jesus is mentioned riding just like Solomon, and people laying the palm tree branches and glorifying him. In every single gospel it's mentioned, this specific instance.
Yes, and I don't remember, I do think that it was Solomon, but I don't remember, yeah. Todd's nodding his head, so I'll take his.
I think it's in the first part of 2 Kings, but yeah, it's neat because it's that image of the Prince of Peace, Prince being the son of David, coming in peace, and that's why when they're shouting Hosanna, they're saying Hosanna to the son of David, because they see this connection to David's son.
Yeah, it's 1 Kings 1. 32, King David said, call me Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah son of Jehoiada. So they came before the king, and the king also said, take with you the servant of your Lord, and have Solomon my son ride my own mule, and take him down to Gihon, and so on.
Daddy?
So, I saw a little bit about the donkey horse situation. And what I read was, and I don't have the reference, but kings normally, when they rode on horses, was to go into battle, meaning war. And actually, it was customary for kings to ride on donkeys, and when it was peace, it would symbolize peace. And that's really what Jesus was doing here, coming into the city, riding on a donkey, symbolizing peace, humility, and compassion. And so that's the take I kind of took on that.
Yeah.
The donkey back during that time was, kings did ride on them.
Yeah.
There were different size during that time too, you know. We don't know what size Jesus rode on. He's depicted as riding on, well, there's a pretty good size one right there. But, you know, kings would ride on donkeys as a symbol of peace.
Yeah. And obviously, we recognize that very specifically with Jesus. This wasn't part of the question, but I do want to point out in verse 11 of chapter 9, it says, "As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I have set your prisoners free from the waterless pit." So we see this covenant language that Zechariah is using here, and how could that be connected to Jesus? Talks about the blood of my covenant there. Jesse?
No, I didn't hear the question. I was asking you to repeat it, sorry.
Oh, yeah, so in verse 11 of chapter 9, he specifically mentions because of the blood of my covenant with you. So how might that relate to Jesus?
Yeah. Well, obvious there. I mean, he had to shed his blood to establish the new covenant.
Yeah, Jesus himself in Matthew 26, it says, "This is the blood of my covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." And so we see this, this covenant relationship that is spoken about there in Zechariah. All right, let's move on to question number 9. This deals with chapter 12, verses 10 through 13, verse 1. Why does Zechariah place mourning and cleansing after the one who is pierced? And what does that order suggest about how restoration comes?
We get the prophesying of the sorrow and guilt of killing their Messiah, but the cleansing from sin that will be provided by the one they pierced.
All right. There in verse 10, it says, "I will pour out on the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and the supplication, so that they will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son." So he specifically talks about they will look on me in whom they have pierced. So God's talking there in the first person now at this point. And so this isn't really poetic language. He's talking in the first person there. And of course we recognize that obviously as Christ. But with this idea of mourning, after mourning comes what? And not mourning as in night and day, but mourning as in weeping. What typically does mourning symbolize?
Sorrow.
Yeah, I think that, talks about that they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. Obviously, I think that typically mourning is going to come after recognition. Once they look at the pierced one and see that and recognize what has happened. And then we see that cleansing is going to follow there in chapter 13. In verse 1, "On that day a fountain will be opened for sin and for impurity." And so we see when we talk about the fountain being opened, and obviously we recognize that with the salvation that we have through Jesus and his blood, the cleansing that comes from that. And the fountain here is tied directly to the piercing, and so the fountain is open because of the fact that the Messiah was pierced. Over in Hebrews chapter 9:26, he has appeared once for all to put away the sin by sacrifice of himself. We know that there's no cleansing apart from the cross. Let's go ahead and try to get number 10, the last one here for lesson 3, and this comes from Zechariah chapter 14. It says, "The Lord is revealed as king over all the earth." How does this chapter unite themes of judgment and holiness, and how does it frame the ultimate hope promised throughout Zechariah?
So there will first be punishment and judgment upon Jerusalem, but then the Lord will raise up Jerusalem, shall be safely inhabited, and shall come to Jerusalem to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, those who are blessed.
Okay. Lena?
Well, there's a lot of division that's mentioned. The judgment divides people, who is faithful and who is not, who did right, who did not. But then in verse 16, it says that everyone who's left is going to worship the king. Yes, worship the king, so they're all united in their worship. And then again in the end, in verse 18, it mentions that if you didn't do right, you get the punishment, like you get no rain or you get the plague. So that's just my punishment. And
Yeah, and I like how verse 8 talks about, and I think this is the ultimate hope that they have, and this is not merely, again, just survival. I think that right now they're still kind of in survival mode, but this is really a restored life from God, and it talks about living waters that are going to flow out of Jerusalem in summer as well as winter. And so this is an image of continual provision and salvation. And of course, we recognize Jesus as the living water. We know that the nations are going to come to worship. It mentions that there in verse 16, like Lena said. And so this is God's ultimate goal now, is a universal recognition of the King, which we, of course, see in Jesus. Daddy?
Jesus told the apostles there in Acts chapter 1 and verse 8, talking about flowing in all directions. He said, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witness in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria to the ends of the earth."
Yep.
Symbolizing there, or showing Jesus' kingship and his power spreading throughout all the earth.
Yep. All right, anybody else on lesson 3? To speed up, I thought we would for sure get into lesson 4, and we did not. But we'll try to speed up with lesson 4. I mean, it's only a couple of chapters. So we'll pick up with lesson 4 next week.